Chapter 18. Allison grit her teeth as she pushed forward and held her hand in front of her to shield her eyes from the freezing, biting wind being blasted into her face. The wind had gotten even worse and was hurling the rain at her so hard her skin was starting to sting from the impact. They marched straight into the harsh elements, slowing their progress down to little more than a crawl and reducing their visibility to only a few feet in front of them. "This is shit," Allison shouted out in frustration, thinking Savannah might have had a point. Fucking rain indeed. Kyle nodded to her but pushed onwards, trying to ignore the constant lashing that stung his face like a swarm of bees. Every inch of exposed skin burned from the cold, and the biting rain, it felt more like hailstones than raindrops. Thunder boomed in the distance, and lightning crackled across the sky, lighting up the air and illuminating the forest for a fraction of a second. All he could see was more dead trees ahead of them. They'd split up into pairs to search a wider area and had been blundering almost blindly through the forest for hours without a trace of them. He put his hand on Allison's shoulder and gripped lightly, pausing her in her tracks. "Stop a second," he had to shout at her to be heard above the howling wind and the thunder. Allison knew what he wanted and nodded in understanding. The pair of them knelt down and huddled together, trying to shield themselves from the rain as Kyle pulled the radio out from his pouch. "Mac, come in," he called out. "Mac, are you there?" "Over." For the umpteenth time, he got no reply, only static, punctuated by the raindrops tapping against the worn plastic. "Mac, where the hell are you?" He turned to Allison and looked down at Cassie, still by her side. "What about her?" he asked. "She tracked Connor's scent for weeks. She's gotta pick up something." Allison looked down at Cassie, seeing the dog look confused as they were, and shook her head at Kyle. "We didn't have all this wind and rain then. She can't track anything in this." They continued on and pushed through the pouring, stinging rain. The weather was their biggest enemy, having already split up their group, and it wasn't showing any signs of easing anytime soon. After more endless marching, Cassie perked up. Her ears pricked, and she stood alert with eyes wide open and focused. "What is it, girl?" Allison asked her, feeling a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold, the wind, or the rain. Cassie had spotted something. She shouldered her weapon and looked around, dreading to see a metal skull grinning at her and Kyle through the trees. There was nothing. Nothing leapt out at them, and no plasma blasts burst through the forest. Allison looked closer at Cassie, trying to figure out what was up with her, when she saw her nostrils flaring rapidly. "Have you got a scent?" she wondered. "She's got a whiff of something," Kyle pointed out, noticing Cassie's nose working overtime. This could be it, Allison thought excitedly. She knelt down and pulled off Cassie's muzzle. "Cassie, search." Cassie let out a long, low growl and suddenly tore through the woods. "Come on." Kyle took off running after Cassie, and Allison dashed after a split second later, catching up to Kyle quickly. The pair of them pushed themselves as hard and as fast as they could to keep Cassie in sight. If they lost her then, they really were screwed. Allison swore as she pushed through low branches that scratched her face and tore at her coat. Several times, she caught her hair on a branch and bunches of strands were torn from her scalp, causing her to tear up slightly in pain, but she ignored it as best she could and carried on. Cassie finally slowed down to a halt in a slightly more open area, like an eye in a storm, where the trees were a lot sparser. She stared at the scene before her and growled warily. "What the hell?" Allison breathed, her eyes wide open like saucers and her mouth agape at the sight Cassie had led them to. Shell casings littered the ground all around them, and a number of trees bore scorch marks and deep black wounds. A few had even toppled over, their trunks severed by plasma fire. That wasn't the worst, however. The forest floor was covered in dark crimson bloodstains and splashes. Pieces of blackened, charred skin and a few black glassy curved fragments lay on the ground bone, as best as Kyle could guess. It was definitely recent, as it hadn't yet soaked up into the soil, though the blood had become fairly watered down with the rain falling down on it. He knelt down and picked up a couple of shell casings in each hand. He took out a wind-up torch and turned it on, shining the red filtered beam onto his hand as he held the casings close to his face and inspected them. 5.56s and 7.62s, he said to Allison. Mac had the other plasma rifle, she commented. But Michelle and the rest had M4s and an AK, Kyle replied. He flashed his light down and swept it across the ground, illuminating all the shell casings and making a rough count. He reckoned there were over 100 rounds scattered on the forest floor. Most were concentrated around a pair of large, felled sequoia trees, perhaps 20 feet from the bloodstains on the ground. Their trunks had been cut at chest height and were covered in plasma burns and scorch marks. One of them was hit, he told her. The others took cover behind these trees. There was no more blood behind the sequoias, so he didn't know what happened to the others. Cassie, search, Kyle commanded again. Cassie looked to Kyle and sniffed the air and the ground, then lay down on her stomach and looked up to Allison. It's no good, Allison said sadly. Either she's lost the scent, or this is as far as it goes. Do you think the others might have gotten away? I don't know, Kyle wished he did. He wanted at least some of them to have made it, but there was no sign of them, and if Cassie couldn't track them then, he had no idea how they were meant to. Allison brought her left wrist close to her face and pulled her jacket sleeve up so she could see the wind-up watch Kyle and Derek had given her years ago, and strained to see what it said in the darkness. Lightning crackled again, and she got a quick glimpse. 0526. We've got to go, she shouted. What? Kyle stared at her as if she'd grown horns. We don't leave our friends behind. That's what separates us from Connor and the tin cans. Looking at the scene in front of them, he was pretty sure that they'd all been killed by machines, but until they knew, he didn't want to just leave if there was any chance they were still alive and needed help. Allison hated herself for even saying it because she agreed with Kyle. She wanted to carry on looking for Mac and the others, but time was running out. She thrust her wristwatch in front of Kyle's face. We've got just over 30 minutes. If we don't head back now, Connor and his tin can are gonna leave us behind. Kyle stared hesitantly at Allison, and then the radio, stricken with indecision. He didn't know if he could ever forgive himself for leaving them behind, but if they didn't then, nobody would get to go back. He switched his radio channel and pressed the comm button again. Derek, we've got something. We found evidence of a firefight, shell casings and some blood. At least one of them was hit. No sign of them after that. Derek's voice crackled out, distorted by the storm interfering with the signal. I'm calling this. We gotta abort and head back to Connor. Kyle sighed regretfully and shook his head in dismay. Understood, we're heading back. They were all but condemning their missing friends to death out here. This was the worst weather he'd seen in over 5 years since J-Day. Nobody lost out here would survive long. He switched back to Mac's channel once more, on the off chance some of them got away. Mac, Michelle, if you can hear this, we're heading northwest. Meet us at the prearranged coordinates or head back to downtown LA, to the basement where we found Connor. Kyle put his radio back into its pouch on his vest, and he and Allison got back to their feet. Kyle looked around one last time, hoping that he'd spot them in the distance. No luck. There was nothing there. He shook his head, and they both took off running through the trees. Both of them were very afraid now. Afraid for Mac, Michelle, and the others, and afraid that they wouldn't make it back to the RV point and Connor, and his little gang would leave them behind. Allison wouldn't put it past the lot of them to take off and abandon them. The black guy, Ellison, seemed okay, but machine was what it was. A schedule was a schedule, and it would insist they left the moment its internal clock turned over 6. She'd spotted how Connor stared at it, all but fawning over the thing, so he'd agree with whatever it said. And Savannah just plain didn't like her, Kyle, or any of them, so she'd probably pack up and leave even before the deadline out of sheer spite. They ran faster through the forest, pushing themselves hard and digging deep, ignoring the biting winds and stinging rain, focused only on moving as fast as they could and getting back to the RV point before first light. Allison found herself breathing raggedly, only taking in the slightest shallow breaths, and her chest burned. The muscles in her leg even more so, aching and begging for rest as she pushed herself almost flat out, dashing round trees in her path. Lightning crackled in the sky, and she glanced again at her watch. 05:49. "We're not gonna make it," she breathed out hoarsely, dread filling her at the thought of being left behind. "We know where they're going," Kyle gasped out alongside her. Worst came to worst, and Connor did set off without them. They'd just follow and catch up. And give them a fucking piece of their minds when they did. Still, it would be better if they did catch up before John decided to set off. As they tore through the woods, Kyle spotted a lighter area to his left, an open area. "This way," he panted to Allison as he turned towards it. When they passed 100 yards, Kyle saw what it was: the freeway. It wasn't the same spot they'd parted with Connor, but it was definitely the same road. "This is it," he told Allison as he ran parallel with the tree line. "Just follow this, and we'll get there." As they ran, the darkness started to fade from an inky blackness into a purplish twilight, lightening into a faint bloody red mixed with gray, as the sun weakly filtered through the millions of tons of dust and rock particles suspended in the upper atmosphere. Allison dashed out of the trees and into the clearing, heading straight onto the tarmac road. Kyle followed after her, but as soon as he was out from under even the limited cover of the bare branches, he felt naked, exposed. All it would take was an HK flying over, or an endo lying in wait somewhere to spot them out in the open and pick them off with a plasma rifle. But it was quicker, he had to admit. "We're out of time," Allison said as she looked at her watch, and it ticked over to exactly 6. Shit, they were going to be left behind. Even if they caught up with them, it would just show what Connor and Co. thought of their allies. "Just keep moving." Kyle pushed himself even harder and lengthened his stride. After what felt like an eternity of running, the signpost finally came into sight. "Our packs are in the tree line," Allison reminded him. They'd have to waste even more time fetching them. And they had no idea where Derek and the others were. They ran back into the tree line and slowed down to a quick march, panting breathlessly from several miles of fast running without a break. They weren't used to pushing themselves that hard. When they got by, eating as little as they did unnecessarily wasting energy was never a good idea. "What took you so long?" Derek waved them over as he slung his pack on. "How'd you get here so fast?" Kyle asked him as he saw Cooper. Myers and Torrance all stood around, pulling on their rucksacks and readying themselves. "I'm fitter than you," Derek shrugged. "Nobody else find any leads?" Allison asked. Everyone sullenly shook their heads and mumbled in dismay. "We should have gone for Mexico," Cooper sighed. "We left them," Allison said woefully, agreeing with him. Mac, Michelle, Rogers, and Everson, all gone, somewhere in this god-forsaken forest. Alive or dead, who knew? And they were leaving them. It wasn't right at all. "We've got no choice," Derek mirrored her earlier words. "We could search forever in this, and with this weather, we won't last long if we try." He hated himself, too, for leaving them, but after Kyle and Allison's discovery, it was more than likely they were dead or captured, and couldn't do anything for them. Allison and Kyle pulled on their packs, Even heavier now, they'd soaked up plenty of rainwater. And as the group of 6 quick marched towards the clearing, down the mud embankment at the end of the tree line and across the freeway. They passed the road sign on the far side and marched into the tree line, all of them glad to be again under even limited cover. Derek was sure, just like Kyle and Allison, that Connor would have set off as soon as it turned 6, but he figured it was worth a try. He led the group forwards and kept his eyes peeled for any signs of a camp, any signs of green canvas sheets or anything that stuck out. He saw nothing. They'd left them. He supposed he shouldn't be surprised. John had told him they wouldn't wait. The bastard. Now what? Torrance kicked a broken branch on the ground in frustration. We carry on to Serrano, Derek said, and just hope we catch them up. It was a hell of a tall order. The weather was still abysmal and showed no sign of letting up anytime soon, and they'd already lost 4 of their friends. Would they even be able to catch up with Connor and the rest? We never should have trusted them, Allison groaned. Something rustled above them, and Allison looked up. Cameron plummeted down to the ground and landed straight in front of Allison and Kyle, bending her knees to take the impact and crouching down as she hit the ground. Shit. She and Kyle both rushed back in shock and fell onto their asses. Where the hell did you come from? Derek asked, incredulous, as Cameron straightened up and stood upright. Up there, Cameron pointed upwards as 3 nylon ropes fell down from above and John, Ellison, and Savannah fast-roped down 3 tree trunks. Within seconds, they were on the ground and collecting their ropes, coiling them up and stuffing them into their packs. I thought you'd gone. Derek stared at John, surprised as hell that he'd actually stayed. What happened to leaving us behind if we weren't back by 6? We decided to wait, Cameron told him. She looked at the group and saw there were still only 6. You didn't find your friends. Kyle shook his head in dismay. They got caught in a firefight, but there's no sign of them. We can't wait any longer, John said. I'm sorry, but we've got to get going. We know, Derek sighed, still reluctant to leave Mac and the others behind but knowing there was no choice. He pointed up to the trees towering above them. What were you doing up there, anyway? Another convoy rolled past at 5:30 and stopped just out there, Ellison said. It was Cameron's idea to climb up the trees, stay quiet and keep out of sight. Endos came into the tree line, as if they were looking for something. They didn't stay long, left about 20 minutes before you got here. If you'd been on time, you would have been caught, Cameron added. Derek had never felt so glad to have been late before, but then another thought crossed his mind. You said they were looking for something. Do you think they might have found the others? It's possible, Cameron replied. Their search pattern appeared random. We shouldn't stay here any longer. She'd been conflicted when 6 a.m. had arrived. Her main priority was to protect John and keep him safe, but he'd wanted to wait, unwilling to abandon Derek and the others. John had suggested Savannah and Ellison leave and Cameron remain behind for Derek, since she could easily track them and catch up without a problem. But she wasn't willing to leave his side. She wouldn't leave him again. We're moving, John said simply. We've got a lot of ground to cover. He turned from the others and started walking away. Cameron immediately followed suit and fell in beside him. We're not taking the rear this time, Derek said to John. He started walking too, and Kyle, Allison, and the others did the same, pushing ahead of Ellison and Savannah. If we get split up again, I don't want to be left behind. John turned round to face Derek as he walked backwards for a moment. Keep up then, he replied. It wasn't his fault Derek's friends had gotten lost in the storm. He sympathized with them. He felt guilty that they were on the move again and leaving them behind, but there was nothing they could do. They had to push on or none of them would make it. We'll keep them behind us, Derek gestured to Savannah and Ellison. If they did get split up again, he reckoned Connor wouldn't hesitate to drop everything and go look for his friends. Fair enough, he thought. He'd prioritize his own friends over John's too, especially with that medal with them. But until they were through the TDE and back into the past, he'd trust Connor as far as he could throw his pet medal. Cameron led the march through the harsh, rocky terrain of Los Padres Forest, a sparse, unforgiving landscape of uncountable hills, rising and falling as far as the eye could see. There were no trees where they were. The vegetation had consisted of largely shrub land before the nuclear detonations, most of which had long since died and decayed to nothing. A few isolated patches still grew a sickly yellowish-brown, but were sparse. Cameron counted only 19 small areas of shrubland in her vision, which covered many square miles. They'd marched up and down hundreds of hills, down through valleys, and the journey had been difficult for some of them. James Ellison had had to stop several times more than the rest of them, slowing their progress further. He was old, but Cameron didn't begrudge him. He and Savannah had protected John, helped him to find her body, and was largely responsible for her and John being reunited. He had taught the values John Henry followed. If not for him then, the other AI would have likely overwritten her instead of merging. She would have allowed him, if he'd protected John in her place, but she found herself glad she was still alive. She'd prefer not to die. She was surprised at that. She'd never cared about her own existence before other than to keep John safe. But she considered it more and decided that being alive was better than not. Functioning is better than not functioning. She corrected her erratic thought patterns. She wasn't alive in a biological sense. She functioned. Strangely, she didn't think that made sense either. She had sensation. She could feel, she thought. She was sentient, sapient. Was that not alive? She didn't know. She resolved to find out. She led the way up to the crest of a particularly large, steep hill, and before she reached the top, she dropped to her knees and crawled up the last few feet to the top. John, just behind her, copied her motion and fell to all fours, and motioned behind him for everyone else to stay put. Allison, in third position, nodded back at him and remained still while he and Cameron carried on and poked their heads over the top of the hill. "Set up camp," John hissed at the others behind them. He sensed hurried movement behind him as they all opened up their packs and pulled out canvases, poles, bungee cords, and other items, and set to work building a series of shelters. John looked down from the hilltop and found himself looking down over a massive valley between two steep hills, at the end of which was Serrano Point and the sea. It had taken days to get there, the route made longer after they'd found out Derek's friends had been attacked by machines. He'd ordered them to take a more indirect route and approach the plant from the north rather than the south or the east, hopefully throwing off any machines. He'd been more worried that the rest of Derek's missing men had been captured rather than killed. Dead men couldn't give up their plans. He took out a pair of binoculars and looked down on the plant and absorbed its features into his memory. The main plant itself was situated right at the land's end, almost right on the edge of a cliff and overlooking the sea. Two large white domes stuck prominently out from behind it. He guessed they were the reactors. A few hundred feet behind it was a series of large transformers that connected via cables to electricity pylons, which in turn ran to others in a long network spread out through the valley and over the hills. Cameron scanned from left to right, searching for defensive positions in and around the plant. She pointed to spots on the crest of the hills overlooking the valley leading to the plant. "Automated weapons," she said quietly to John. They were positioned to attack anything approaching from the valley, the most obvious route attackers would take. "Centaurs patrolling the perimeter," she noted to him. She could see 4 of them, but there would be more elsewhere. The plant would have its own garrison of endoskeletons, 40 to 60, she estimated. "I see an airfield," John said, peering through the field glasses. Without them, he'd barely be able to make out anything at all. He was slightly envious of Cameron's superior vision, among other abilities. He made out 4 HKs on it, sat idly on metal landing struts on the landing field that had once been the employee car park. "Thought there'd be more," he said, not at all disappointed. 4 was more than enough. "Vandenberg Air Base is 32 miles away," Cameron told him, the largest Skynet air base in California after LAX, and one of the largest in the western United States. Squadrons of HKs and a battalion of endoskeletons could be scrambled quickly and flown to support the plant if necessary. "Great," John mumbled. "So if we screw this up, we can expect an army of tin cans to swoop down on us." "You won't fail," Cameron insisted. "How'd you know that?" John asked doubtfully. "Because you won't. You believe in me that much." John raised an eyebrow at her. Wasn't she supposed to be the logical one out of them? "I do." Cameron stared firmly at him. Not because he was John Connor. She'd watched him since she'd been returned to his side, and she'd observed changes in him. He was harder, more resolute, more sure of himself, and more decisive. "You're leading 2 groups on a dangerous mission. They trust you to lead them." "I trust you." "I've got a lot to live up to," John thought nervously. He looked down at the plant through the binoculars and carefully scrutinized every inch of the plant, the perimeter, and the surrounding area, looking for the easiest way in. As he did, Cameron created a number of programs she intended to use to gain access to Serrano Point's security systems, using the ones John Henry had formed as a template. She wasn't willing to risk using the exact same attack twice, knowing Skynet was adaptive and had probably devised countermeasures against them. She created a number of worm programs that should be sufficient to bypass Skynet's cyber defenses. Without an airborne ECM capability, she couldn't take control of the plant like she had done with the factory, but she didn't need to in order to do what was needed. John studied the plant and dedicated every detail to memory, even though Cameron could do with perfect recall. He needed to know exactly where to go or not to in case anything happened. He wanted to know exactly where he was going every step of the way, so he wouldn't find himself unsure of what to do. Indecision would get them all killed if things went south. He stared at the plant silently for over an hour, remaining as perfectly still as he could, careful even to keep his breathing calm and slow, and to breathe out through his nose so no puffs of steam escaped his warm mouth into the cold air. A plan slowly started to come together as he studied the terrain surrounding the plant. A lot would have to go right for it to work, but it was their best shot. The pair of them slipped back down the hill and saw the handiwork Derek and the others had done while he and Cameron had been observing the plant. They'd used poles and waterproof canvases to build 5 shelters in a circle. There'd been no trees, so they'd elevated them using thin aluminum poles and rods, and dug into the ground beneath them to give more room whilst keeping them low to the ground. The spoil had been sprinkled lightly over the tops of the stretched canvases to help them blend in from above. The others were all in their shelters, laid out under the canvases and waiting for John to come back. When Ellison saw John coming back down from the hilltop, he rolled out and crouched down on his knees, as did Savannah a moment later. Derek followed their example, and one by one all the fighters filtered out of their shelters and into the area in the middle of the camp. "What did you find?" Ellison asked, spotting the look on John's face. John had something, and Ellison knew it. "It's down there," John answered. "And it's heavily defended. 40 or 50 endos, a flight of HKs, centaurs, and sentry guns dotted all around." "How the hell are we going to get in?" Cooper asked. "I can access the plant and hack into their security mainframe," Cameron answered. In English. Marlin stared at her. "I can turn off their security systems and open the back door," Cameron explained. "Then do it," Kyle said enthusiastically. He found it odd that another machine was their ace in the hole. This had definitely been the weirdest few days of his life. Not yet, John said. We go in an hour after last light, he told them. He turned and pointed to a steep ridge that ran towards the plant and then tapered down towards the ground. Along that ridge, it runs towards the transformers at the back of the plant. Cameron will hack into the plant and shut off their sensors and automated defenses, and we sneak in. The AIU are on their way, Cameron added. Half will attack the plant from the north as a distraction. The rest will cover our exit. What the heck's an AIU? Dyer asked. Autonomous infantry units, Cameron said. Endos, Savannah translated into layman's terms. John nodded at Cameron and gave a small smile. He was supposed to be this great military leader, apparently, but she had as many ideas as him. Once we're through the fence, Cameron will take the lead and guide us into the plant itself, he said. Why the metal? Derek asked dubiously. Another woolly part of the plan now. He didn't want to trust the success of the mission, not to mention their lives, to this tin can, regardless of how much Connor might trust it. He didn't. I've been here before, Cameron answered, anticipating John's line of thought. John's command HQ was in Serrano Point. In this other timeline, right? Kyle asked. Cameron nodded once. I know the layout and where the power distribution computers are located. If you say so, Allison eyed her suspiciously. John snapped his attention to Allison and stared at her, his face stony and almost red with anger. Is there a problem? He snapped at her. He'd had enough. He could understand Allison's distaste, but it was no excuse. Cameron had proven herself to him time and again now. He trusted her implicitly. No problem. Allison held his glare for a second before she turned away. Good. They were all in this together. Their only chance was if they all pulled their weight and stayed united. It had been enough to keep Savannah from trying to kill Weaver, and he'd thanked his lucky stars that she'd chosen to remain behind and work on the TDE. He wondered if he'd done the right thing by keeping his distance from Derek and the others when they'd thrown the party. Maybe he should have joined in like Savannah, though from what he'd heard, she hadn't actually done much talking. Kyle had told him on the trip up through the sewers that between the occasional arm wrestle and tidbits of brief chatter as she'd filled her mug, she'd spent most of the night drinking alone, away from the main group. That didn't surprise John at all. He looked towards Savannah and realized they were both loners. He had Cameron now and she had Ellison, but neither of them would ever fit in with a crowd. They were outcasts, and for the first time in a while, he wondered what any of them would really do with themselves once they got back and managed to stop Skynet. What time is it? He asked Cameron. 11:15 a.m., she answered. Sun sets at 8:53 p.m. Say last light at 9:30, Ellison said helpfully. We move out at 10:30 then, John replied. He looked to Ellison and Savannah. You guys take first watch. Kyle and Marlin will take over in 2 hours. He handed Ellison the binoculars he'd just been using, and the pair of them, Savannah, took their weapons and vests from their shelter, along with a sheet of canvas and some pegs, and moved up to the crest of the hill where he and Cameron had just come down from, leaving the rest of them in the camp. Everyone else gets some sleep. Hard routine, Derek followed up with an order of his own. No fires and no cooking. They couldn't afford for machines to spot any smoke. They were far enough from the plant, maybe 2 miles to be safe from patrols and automated sentries. But security cameras and sensors, not to mention the Endo's eyes, would pick up a campfire in no time at all. They'd made it this far. They couldn't afford any fuck-ups now. Ellison peered through the binoculars and stared down at the plant down at the end of the valley. He turned his attention to the left of the plant and could just about see the ocean, Waves crashed against the beach again and again, slowly, minutely eating away at the shore. All they had to do was wait 1,000 years or so, and nature would take care of the power plant for them. He shivered slightly from the cold air, the canvas sheet draped over himself, and Savannah did little to shelter them from the cold air or the sea breeze that blew over them. The strangest thing he found, being this close to the coast, was the distinct lack of seagulls. Back in the day, before the war, there'd have been hundreds of the things flying all around, scavenging and cawing annoyingly at all hours of the day and night. Now their absence was noticeable. He looked to Savannah at his right, as she stared intently down at the power plant and made her own assessment of the defenses. Infrared and motion sensors, automated plasma cannons, centaurs, looks like 50-plus endos positioned in and around the place. They've got a goddamn army. An HK flew out in the distance and headed east, inland. Ellison wondered if it would find Cameron's endo platoon. He hoped not. Those things might just be what they'd need to get out alive later on. He'd take any help they could get. He watched Savannah as she observed the power plant, and he couldn't help but feel bad for her. He didn't want this life for her, but at the same time she didn't know anything else. She'd grown up fighting the machines. She'd had her childhood robbed from her, her parents not only taken but erased, made into nothing more than foul memories by Weaver, and most of her life had been pain and sadness, pushed down and forcing her to become hard. He worried about what her life in the past would be like. How would she cope? Her formal education had stopped at age 7, when they'd gone into hiding, so college would be out of the question. He worried that despite what she'd said earlier, she'd end up as a gun for hire out in Iraq or Afghanistan or some other war-torn part of the world, unable to fit in doing anything else. "When we get back, I'm going to get a job, put you through school," he said to her. He wanted her to have a future. "You don't have to do that for me," Savannah replied. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not. I just want to do right by you. I can't see you flipping burgers for the rest of your life." It saddened him to think that in the past, with her education and her history, either that or mercenary work was about all she could look forward to. He'd kept her reading when they'd gone into hiding before the bombs fell, bought her a new book every week, and she'd absorb each one like a sponge. Their hideout after J-Day had been filled with all her favorite ones, and she'd loved to read by candlelight at night, before the machines had started to roll out in force. She was bright as a button, but without any high school or college diplomas, it'd be hard for her. Savannah put down her weapon and turned towards him. She smiled at him gratefully and shifted slightly closer to him. She couldn't help but grin at his concern for her. She was thankful he cared so much about her, but she found it a little ironic. "Funny, I'd been planning to take care of you, old man." "Oh." He looked at her with widened eyes, his curiosity piqued now. "You had a plan?" "Yeah," she nodded. He was right. She wasn't going to flip burgers or work in a supermarket or a factory when she got back. She wanted to live her life. She didn't want to have to fight once they got back. The whole reason they were going back was to avoid it, but at the same time, she had to admit they'd never had a dull day. She'd been thinking about it since before she'd got really trashed, and she'd spent a lot of time deep in inebriated thought that night. She'd wanted to think of what she'd do with her life. "I don't want to fight, but I want something exciting. Get the adrenaline going once in a while." "And?" Ellison asked. "Maybe become a cop," Savannah said. Ellison couldn't keep his face straight, nor could he stop himself, letting out a small snort of laughter. "What?" Savannah stared at him. "Nothing, nothing." He shook his head. "Just don't tell Sarah when we get back. She liked you before, she might not after that." "Like I'd arrest her," she rolled her eyes. "Not like a city cop, anyway. Maybe in a small town somewhere." "Sheriff Weaver, it's got a ring to it," Ellison nodded. Now he thought about it, he could all too easily see her doing it. Woe betide the poor soul she caught speeding or shoplifting. Out of good cop and bad cop, he knew exactly which one Savannah would be. Not Weaver, Savannah shook her head. She refused to share the same name as the thing that probably killed her real parents and pretended to be her mom, especially as everyone else seemed to call it Weaver. How about Ellison? She suggested. He'd been like a father to her for the past 18 years. You pretty much adopted me anyway. Ellison smiled back at her. He'd always wanted to have kids, and she was right. She was basically the daughter he'd never had. Sounds good to me, he said. John opened his eyes and instantly snapped awake, sensing movement nearby. He saw Kyle and Allison with their rifles, moving across the camp and up the hill to take watch. He poked his head out from under the canvas and looked at the rest of the shelters. He couldn't see any movement under them. Either they were asleep or keeping as still as humanly possible. He watched as Ellison and Savannah walked down towards their shelter, noticing the subtle smile on the latter's face and wondering what had happened whilst they were on watch. It wasn't her smile but her eyes that were the biggest difference. She looked happy, something he hadn't seen in her since, well, ever. They have a lot to look forward to, Cameron said to John, anticipating what he was thinking. She'd eavesdropped on their conversation out of curiosity and had heard every word. Yeah, John agreed. The mission was as much for them as for anything else, to give them a second chance at life. He looked back to Kyle and Allison up on the hill, watching over the power plant. Is it a good idea for them to be up there together alone? John asked her. After what happened the other night. You mean they had sex? Real subtle, Cameron. Subtlety's not part of my programming, she replied. She didn't understand the need for subtlety and hints. Direct communication was more efficient, and from all social interactions, she'd observed she judged things would be simpler if people were straightforward. Fair enough, John shrugged. But yeah, that. He was still curious about Kyle and Allison. More about Kyle, if he was honest. He didn't really care much for Allison and knew she didn't think much of him either. What time is it? 7:30, Cameron told him. 2 hours until last light. I'm going to take watch with Kyle, he said as he reached for his rifle and started to edge out from under the canvas. Cameron shot out her hand and grabbed John by the wrist, stopping him. You need to sleep, she told him. Since they'd been under the canvas, they'd been in close physical contact, and she'd monitored his vital signs throughout. He'd only slept for 4 hours out of the last 40, pushing himself hard and leading with her from the front. I need to take another look at the plant, John said. In case I missed anything. I'll send Allison down. He slipped out of his sleeping bag, rolled it up and stuffed it into his rucksack, checked all his gear was packed away and grabbed his weapon and vest, and crawled out from under the canvas. He made his way up the hill and saw 2 lumps in the shelter Savannah, and Ellison had set up as an observation post, and noticed the 2 pairs of worn brown boots just slightly poking out of the back. He prodded the smaller pair with the side of his feet and saw rustling as Allison crawled backwards out of the OP. What is it? She asked, looking up at John. I'll take this watch, John said quietly to her. Go get some sleep. Why? You've done your shift. Because I said so, John replied gruffly. Go eat something and get your head down. We've got 3 hours. Allison disappeared back into the OP, and John heard a brief kiss between them before she emerged again with her weapon and webbing. All yours, she said as she passed by and made her way down to the camp. John got onto all 4s and crawled underneath, taking Allison's place. The ground was still warm from where she'd been laying a good thing, John supposed. It wasn't raining anymore, and the winds were gone, but the air was still very cold. He reckoned if he'd asked Cameron, she'd have told him it was a degree or 2 below freezing. He picked up the binoculars left on the ground and started to look over the plant, soaking up everything he saw like a sponge. "What are you doing here?" Kyle asked him, keeping his head straight forward and not once taking his eyes off the plant ahead of them. "Taking watch," John replied. "Keeping an eye on us, you mean?" Kyle said. "You still don't trust us. You guys haven't really given me much reason to." "But that's not it." Kyle stared forward through the scope on his plasma rifle, a Schmidt and Bender hunting scope he'd jury-rigged to the top of the weapon years ago, and kept his eyes on a centaur patrolling along one of the valleys to the northeast of the plant. He turned to face John, taking his attention from the patrol as it disappeared down into the valley. "So what is it?" "Let's just say I was worried you and Allison would be paying attention to something other than the plant," John said, a slight smirk on his face. "Oh," Kyle caught on and grinned sheepishly, feeling himself turn red with embarrassment. "You all heard it then." "Cameron did," John said. He decided not to mention that he'd almost accidentally walked in on them. "I wouldn't have thought, though. You and Allison. How did you guys even meet?" "Long time ago," Kyle said. "Back when there actually was a resistance against the tin cans. I was 15 at the time. Derek and I were in a squad patrolling around Palmdale, planting wides along Skynet supply and patrol routes. HK buzzed overhead, and we scattered for cover. I ended up diving into an overturned dumpster and ended up face to face with this little girl, maybe 9 or 10, filthy, half-starved, and scared to death. She backed into the corner and stared at me, terrified, too afraid to even move. She told me about her family," John said. "Guess she saw you with a gun and thought you were after her." Kyle nodded at John. He was spot on. The HK passed over without seeing us, and Derek called us all out. I couldn't leave this little girl all alone, so I tried to pull her out with me. Bet that didn't go down well." Kyle raised his right hand and showed John the skin on the back of it. A series of short pink scars ran together on the back of his hand, in a semicircle running from the knuckle of his forefinger to the base of his thumb. To John, they looked a lot like teeth marks. "Could say that." Kyle absently ran his fingers over the scars. "She bit me hard. Almost down to the bone. Good survival instinct. Anyway, I managed to drag her out of the dumpster and we brought her back with us. She didn't say anything for 3 days, just sat in the corner and watched us. She told me later she was afraid we'd kill her." "What did you do?" John asked. "We'd kept dogs with us for a while. They could sniff out metal before we even saw it coming, and they were pretty handy hunting for food. A few days after we found Allison, one of our bitches gave birth to a litter of puppies. I gave one of them to her to cheer her up, taught her how to look after it, and gave it a name. Cassie," John realized. "We started to bond," Kyle said. "We got close, like brother and sister almost, even when she started growing up. But it wasn't until our last night in the subway that anything really happened between us." "What about you and Cameron?" Kyle asked. That took John completely off guard. Both the question itself and the fact Kyle hadn't said Cameron rather than metal bitch or anything similar. "How'd you mean?" he asked. "There's something going on there," Kyle said. "I'm not blind, Connor." "John." "Okay, John. But what's the deal with you two?" "Long story." Kyle pointed up to the sky. It was still a dull gray and the sun hadn't begun to set yet. "Not like we're going anywhere," he prompted. "My future self sent her to protect me when I was 15. She kept me safe, protected me from this other machine sent back to kill me. Things got complicated." "I'll say," Kyle replied. He picked up his rifle once again and peered through it. He looked onto the airfield and saw it now held 6 HKs, not 4 like they'd previously thought. Plus however many were in the air on patrol. He really didn't like how there could be a whole legion of tin cans in there without them knowing about it. "You two are pretty close, then?" he asked. "You came forward nearly 20 years. You must care a lot about her." John noticed there was no revulsion in Kyle's voice, no recoiling in horror or snide tone to his remark. "You don't find it weird?" "Yeah, but whatever," Kyle shrugged. "I'd keep her away from Allison once we're back. Things could get ugly between them." "Can't argue with that," John agreed. He looked through the binoculars and made another sweep of the plant. Cameron had told him they wanted to enter the largest building, in front of the reactors. Inside, there was the power distribution systems they'd need to sabotage to ensure Skynet couldn't reroute the power away from Zyra Corp once they were done. "I'm sorry about your friends," John said, meaning all of them. The ones who'd been killed by the T-888 as well as Mac and the others. They'd agreed to help him on this operation, and now they were gone. "Once we go back, we stop Skynet, right?" Kyle asked. "You know how." "That's the plan," John nodded. "I guess if we manage it, at least they won't have died for nothing," he said, understandably. "We can give them a chance in my time," John said, starting to see a little of Weaver's thinking. "It's not the same, but it's something. They could go back and give everyone a second chance. That's what this mission was all about," he realized. It wasn't just about going home now he'd found Cameron. He now had the fate of the world resting on his shoulders once again. He hoped this time it would be the last. John stood in front of the group as they hurried to disassemble their camp and stow it all away into their packs. Cameron had already packed their own shelter away into her rucksack and placed it on the ground underneath a single large sheet they'd laid out to cover the packs from view. The sun had set, and it was now fully dark, so their features were hard to make out in the darkness. "It's 10:30, Cameron told John, stood beside him with her plasma rifle shouldered and ready. "It's time," John said to the others. "Savannah, Ellison, Derek, and Kyle, you're with us. Everyone else stays here." "No way," Allison shook her head. "We're not staying behind." She didn't want to leave Kyle and Derek alone with John, not with their track record of losing friends every time they dealt with him. "We can't all go," John said to her. "We need people to cover our exit and keep eyes on the plant. Tell us if anything changes." "Wait a minute," Marlon started. He pointed his finger at Cameron. "You said before it took months of wearing the place down before you could take it in the other timeline. So why are you now saying we do it with half a dozen men?" "Stealth," Cameron replied. "Less people means less chance of being caught." "I want to go with you," Allison argued, her tone resolute. "We're not arguing about this," John snapped. "We're going. Now." Kyle strode forward, but Allison grabbed his hand and spun him around to face her. She pulled his face down towards hers and pressed her lips to his, as she wrapped her arms around him and felt him do the same. "Cover our asses," he smiled at her. She kissed him once more and reluctantly let him go. She wanted so badly to join them, more than anything, but she could see from John's face that wouldn't happen. She'd do everything she could to make sure Kyle and Derek got back okay. John stopped them just behind the top of the hill and turned to Cameron. "Ready?" he asked her. "Yes," Cameron replied. She opened up her wireless communications array and probed the plant's defenses. She was immediately met by numerous firewalls and defensive applications that interrogated her for identification. Cameron activated her own adapted version of the brute force program John Henry had developed and attacked the firewalls. Skynet had adapted, she realized, and had created defenses to combat her brute force attacks. She'd anticipated it, however, as she'd warned John Henry. She increased the attacks and simultaneously selected a virus she'd created especially from the occasion. She wrapped it in a worm program and uploaded it, making short work of the defenses as it burrowed through firewalls and created hundreds of copies of itself. Cameron ceased her brute force attacks and allowed the worm to spread itself throughout the plant's defenses, rapidly invading and overwhelming them whilst she monitored their progress. In seconds, she had a backdoor into of all the plant's operations. But Skynet was adaptive, and she knew it wouldn't last. Cameron accessed the backdoor and took control of the plant's security systems. The images captured by scores of security cameras, infrared and motion sensors washed over Cameron as she saw everything Serrano Point could see. The sheer amount of sensory input flooding her CPU was a strange sensation. She'd experienced it before when John had inserted her into the Artie system, and she'd seen through the sensors and cameras of John Henry's UCAVs, but it was still intriguing. She liked it. She disabled all of the sensors and cameras, rendering the power plant's security systems completely blind. Then she began her second stage. She opened up a wireless connection to the 12 AIU positioned north of the plant and commanded them to start their attack. "It's done," Cameron told John. He nodded solemnly to her and took a deep, nervous breath as he stepped out over the crest of the hill and started down the other side. "Let's go,"